The firing wasn't the mistake. It was the arrogance behind it. Victor Ashford had just pointed his finger at his pregnant wife, Vera, and shouted, "You're fired," in front of 15 of the world's most powerful investors. But what he didn't realize was that he had just terminated the secret owner of Ashford Global without even knowing it. Vera stood there in her burgundy dress, her hand resting on her unborn child, watching her husband trade his soul for the approval of his mistress, Chloe. Victor thought he was clearing the way for a new life, but he had actually just signed the death warrant for his own career. For 2 years, Vera had played the role of the humble, struggling wife, quietly funding Victor's dreams through shell corporations he thought were lucky breaks. But that one sentence, "Get out of my office, you're nothing but a distraction," had just ended the test and their marriage. The investors in the room gasped, but their shock wasn't just about the cruelty they'd witnessed. It was about what would happen when the trillionaire they were all there to meet stopped pretending to be a victim. Victor turned back to his presentation, dismissing Vera with a smirk, unaware he had just made the costliest error of his life. Chloe's satisfied smile widened as Vera turned toward the door, but neither the mistress nor the husband understood that the very company they were standing in was Vera's birthright. Vera's hand reached for the door handle, but instead of leaving, she pulled out her phone and sent a 3-word text: "Execute Protocol Langford." Would the man who chose his mistress over his pregnant wife recognize his error when the truth emerged? Could 15 investors maintain their composure when the woman they watched being humiliated revealed she had been evaluating their judgment all along? And what would Victor do when Vera's next move forced him to realize that everything he owned, from his designer suit to the air he breathed, belonged to the wife he just discarded? Please press the subscribe button and seat back. Relax. Listen to Folktale by Asher. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom hadn't even finished vibrating from the force of Victor's dismissal before Vera's mind retreated to a place far colder and more calculating than this office. She could still feel the phantom heat of humiliation on her skin, but it was eclipsed by the memory of a sterile hospital room 3 years ago. Her father, Robert Langford, had been a man who measured the world in leverage and legacies. On his deathbed, his hand, once capable of moving markets with a single signature, had gripped hers with a desperate, bony strength. "Vera," he had whispered, his voice a dry rattle, "the world doesn't see people, it sees price tags. They will crawl to you for your billions, they will lie for your shares, and they will kill for your crown." He had made her a trillionaire with the stroke of a pen, but he had also left her a curse. The Langford test. "Find someone who sees the woman, not the bank account," he'd commanded. "Live as a nobody, Vera. Strip away the silk and the private jets. If they love you when you have nothing, only then can you trust them when you have everything." So, Vera had built a cage of poverty out of choice. She had traded her custom-tailored suits for off-the-rack maternity wear and her penthouse for a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet. When she met Victor Ashford, he was a mid-level manager with a silver tongue and eyes that seemed to burn with genuine passion. For 2 years, she had played the part of the struggling graphic designer, the wife who clipped coupons and worried about the electricity bill. She had watched him climb the corporate ladder, secretly greasing the rungs with her hidden influence, ensuring every lucky break his company received was actually a calculated gift from Langford Industries. She had wanted so badly for her father to be wrong. Every time she cooked a simple meal or hid her diamond heritage behind a $10 wedding band, she was praying that Victor would be the exception to the Langford rule. She had wanted a partner, not a subject. But as Victor's power grew, the man she thought she loved began to dissolve, replaced by the very monster her father had warned her about. Victor didn't just want success, he wanted the feeling of standing on someone else to reach it. He had failed the test long before today, but the sting of his words in front of the investors was the final, undeniable proof. As she walked toward the elevator, Vera didn't feel like a discarded wife. She felt the cold, hard weight of the Langford blood finally taking over. The nobody was gone. The trillionaire was back, and she was done testing. Now she was going to grade. The transition from the boardroom's cold marble to the memory of her wedding day felt like stepping from a blizzard into a flickering candle's warmth. 2 years ago, Vera had stood in a small city hall wearing a simple white dress she'd bought at a thrift store for $40. There were no flashing cameras, no guest list of dignitaries, and certainly no billion-dollar dowry on display. Victor had looked at her then with eyes that seemed to promise a lifetime of protection. "It's just us against the world, Vera," he'd whispered, sliding a modest silver band onto her finger. At the time, she had felt a rare, soaring sense of freedom. For the first time in her life, she wasn't a portfolio or a target. She was just a woman being loved. But the simplicity was a meticulously crafted illusion. While they spent their first year in a cramped apartment where the heater groaned through the winter, Vera was living a double life that required the discipline of a spy. She would wait for Victor to fall asleep, his breathing heavy with the exhaustion of a man trying to build a startup from nothing, and then she would slip into the kitchen. There, under the hum of a flickering yellow bulb, she would open a decrypted laptop and move mountains. She remembered the night she'd authorized the purchase of the very company Victor now claimed as his own. He had come home dejected, slumped over a bowl of instant noodles, telling her that his firm was on the brink of collapse. "We need a miracle, Vera," he'd said, his head in his hands. That miracle arrived 48 hours later in the form of an anonymous angel investor from a Langford Shell corporation. Victor had wept with joy, cradling her stomach and promising that their child would never know the cheap life they were living. Vera had smiled through her own tears, moved by his apparent devotion. She had used her vast wealth to quietly buy up his competitors, to clear his regulatory hurdles, and to ensure that every contract he won was handed to him on a silver platter by her hidden hand. She had intentionally kept their personal life modest, wanting to ensure that his character grew alongside his bank account. She had worn the same 3 maternity dresses and clipped coupons for groceries, all while her personal net worth grew by billions. She had been the wind beneath his wings, never realizing that as soon as he flew high enough, he would decide that the wind was no longer necessary. Looking back, the cheap life hadn't been a burden to her, it had been a sanctuary. But to Victor, it had clearly been a prison he couldn't wait to escape, and a woman he couldn't wait to replace. The shift hadn't happened overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the man she thought she knew. As the miracle investments from Langford Shell corporations began to pad the company's bottom line, the modest silver wedding band on Victor's finger seemed to tarnish in his eyes. He started coming home in the small, hollow hours of the morning, his breath heavy with expensive scotch, and his silk lapels carrying the cloying, floral scent of a perfume Vera didn't own. When she would wait up for him, her back aching from the weight of their growing child, he wouldn't offer a kiss or an apology. Instead, he would look at her swollen ankles and her simple cotton nightgown, with a cold, detached disdain that cut deeper than any blade. "You look like a tired housemate, Vera," he'd snapped one evening, recoiling when she reached out to touch his arm. "I'm out there negotiating with titans, and I come home to this." The "this" was the life she had carefully maintained to keep them grounded, but to Victor, it had become a badge of shame. He began to scrub her from his public life like a persistent stain. The invitations to corporate galas and charity auctions started disappearing, and when she did manage to accompany him, he would introduce her as a family friend or a distant relative before ushering her toward the furthest corner of the room. He replaced his worn leather briefcase with Italian calfskin and his empathy with an insatiable hunger for status. At dinner, he no longer spoke of their future or the nursery they were supposed to be painting. He spoke of optics and market dominance. He began to mock her cheap habits in front of his new high-flying associates, laughing as he told them how his wife still insisted on checking the prices of groceries. Vera watched him from across their dinner table, her heart hardening with every cruel joke. She saw the way his eyes lit up when his senior VP, Chloe, walked into a room, a woman who dripped in the very diamonds Vera had hidden in a vault across town. Victor was intoxicated by a world he didn't realize she owned. He treated her like a burden, an embarrassing relic of his struggling past that he needed to discard to reach the summit. He had become so blinded by the glimmer of his own rising star that he couldn't see the supernova standing right in front of him. Every time he pushed her away or sneered at her vulnerability, he was adding another brick to the wall between them. Vera realized then that her father's test wasn't just about finding out if Victor loved her money. It was about finding out what Victor would do once he thought he didn't need her anymore. The answer was becoming painfully clear. He wasn't just failing the test, he was burning the classroom down. The transformation was complete the day Victor announced the executive shuffle. Vera had arrived at the office unannounced, carrying a small bag of her favorite homemade muffins, a final, desperate attempt to touch the man who used to love her. But as she stood in the shadow of the frosted glass door, she heard the celebratory pop of a champagne cork. Victor wasn't alone. Chloe sat perched on the edge of his mahogany desk, her laughter like shards of glass. Victor was raising a glass to her, his face flushed with the triumphant glow Vera hadn't seen in months. "To the new senior vice president of operations," he declared, his voice booming with pride he never directed toward his wife. "The only person in this company who actually understands what it takes to win." Vera stepped into the room, her hand instinctively shielding her stomach as if she could protect the baby from the coldness of the atmosphere. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victor's smile didn't just fade, it curdled into a mask of pure irritation. He didn't introduce her, he didn't even acknowledge the gift in her hand. He simply checked his gold watch, a watch Vera had secretly paid for, and sighed. "Vera, what are you doing here? This is a professional environment, and you're noticeably out of place." He didn't say the word pregnant, but he looked at her midsection as if it were a clerical error he couldn't wait to delete. Chloe didn't move from the desk. Instead, she adjusted her designer blazer and gave Vera a faux sympathy that didn't reach her predatory eyes. "Victor, honey, maybe she just needs more grocery money," she purred. Victor didn't defend Vera. He didn't even flinch at the disrespect. Instead, he took Vera by the elbow and guided her toward the door with a firm, dismissive grip. "I need you to stay invisible for the next few weeks, Vera," he whispered harshly once they were in the hallway. "The big investors are coming in, and they expect to see a certain image of success. A struggling housewife in a bargain bin dress doesn't fit the brand I'm building." He looked at her then, not as a husband looking at the mother of his child, but as a CEO looking at a faulty piece of equipment. "Go home. Stay there. Don't call me unless it's an emergency. I have a company to run, and Chloe is the one helping me do it." Vera watched him walk back into the office, the door clicking shut like a gavel. She looked down at the muffins, still warm in their paper bag, and then at the sleek glass walls of the empire she had built for him. He wanted her invisible? Fine, she would be the ghost in his machine until the very moment she chose to haunt him. He had chosen the mistress's ambition over the wife's loyalty, never realizing that by promoting Chloe, he had just handed the keys of his downfall to the woman he had just told to hide. The morning of the quarterly investor summit felt like the sharpening of a blade. Vera stood before her bedroom mirror, smoothing the fabric of the burgundy maternity dress she had bought specifically for this occasion. It was elegant, yet humble enough to maintain the illusion Victor had come to despise. She knew what was coming. She had seen the calendar invites, the secret hushed calls between Victor and Chloe, and the cold, clinical way her husband had looked at her over breakfast, as if she were a line item he was finally ready to strike through. When she entered the boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hushed murmurs of 15 of the world's most elite venture capitalists. Victor stood at the head of the mahogany table, looking every bit the titan of industry she had manufactured him to be. Chloe sat to his right, her posture triumphant, her eyes raking over Vera's pregnant frame with a cruelty that was almost predatory. As Vera approached, the room went silent. "Vera," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave to project a dominance he hadn't earned. He didn't offer her a chair. He didn't even acknowledge the gift in her hand. He simply checked his gold watch, a watch Vera had secretly paid for, and sighed. Vera, what are you doing here? This is a professional environment, and you're noticeably out of place. He didn't say the word pregnant, but he looked at her midsection as if it were a clerical error he couldn't wait to delete. A murmur of confusion rippled through the investors. Vera's hand tightened on her belly as Victor took a step toward her, his finger pointing aggressively toward the door. You've become a liability, Vera. Your presence here is a distraction to the board and an embarrassment to the brand. I've had the legal team prepare the documents. As of this moment, you are formally terminated from any and all associations with this company. You are fired, Vera. Publicly, irrevocably. The humiliation was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that rose to her cheeks. She looked at the investors, men and women she had known by name since she was a child, people who had once bowed to her father, and saw them shifting in their seats, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. Chloe let out a small, jagged laugh, leaning back in her chair to savor the spectacle. Victor's eyes burned with an arrogant fire, believing he had finally pruned the cheap branch from his golden tree to make room for his mistress. Vera didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stood in the center of the room, the target of their silent judgment, and felt the last tether to her undercover life snap. Victor thought he was casting her out of his world, never realizing he was standing in hers. She took a slow, deep breath, her eyes locking onto Victor's with a clarity that finally made his smirk falter. The test was over. The grading was about to begin. The silence following Victor's declaration was brittle, broken only by Chloe's soft, triumphant chuckle. Victor adjusted his lapels, his face a mask of smug satisfaction as he waited for Vera to retreat in shame. But Vera didn't move. Instead, she reached into the small clutch purse Victor had mocked for being out of season and retrieved a sleek black smartphone. She tapped the screen once, a single notification that rippled through the digital ether like a silent explosion. A second later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a synchronized precision that commanded instant attention. A phalanx of 6 lawyers in charcoal gray suits marched in, led by Marcus Thorne, a man whose legal reputation was so fearsome that 3 of the investors at the table instinctively stood up, as if a judge had entered the room. Victor's brow furrowed in confusion, his pointing finger finally dropping. What is the meaning of this? This is a private board meeting. Security. Security is already under my jurisdiction, Mr. Ashford, Marcus Thorne said, his voice dropping like a gavel. He didn't even look at Victor. He walked straight to Vera and bowed his head slightly. The protocols are in place, ma'am. The board has been notified. The transfer of authority is complete. Thorne turned to the room, placing a thick stock of documents on the mahogany table. For those of you who don't recognize the Langford Estates primary counsel, let me be brief. You are not here today to invest in Ashford Global. You are here because Ashford Global is a wholly owned subsidiary of Langford Industries, and Langford Industries is not represented by Victor Ashford. He paused, the tension in the room reaching a fever pitch as the investors scanned the documents, their faces turning from confusion to absolute horror. It is represented by its sole owner and CEO, Vera Langford. Victor's face went from a flush of anger to a ghostly, sickly pale. He looked from the lawyers to the investors, who were now staring at him not with respect, but with the pity reserved for a man who had accidentally stepped off a cliff. Vera? Langford? He stammered, his voice cracking. That's impossible. You're a graphic designer. You're my wife. I am the woman who bought your debt 2 years ago, Victor, Vera said, her voice finally cutting through the air, cold and resonant as a cathedral bell. She walked slowly to the head of the table, the seat Victor had just occupied. Chloe scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over her own chair, her smug expression replaced by a panicked realization. Vera didn't look at her. She looked at the men and women she had been testing. My father taught me that power is invisible until it is exercised. You all watched as this man attempted to humiliate the mother of his child for the sake of his ego. You said nothing. She sat down in the executive chair, her hand resting firmly on her belly. The meeting will now come to order, and the first item on the agenda is the immediate removal of the former CEO. The air in the boardroom, once thick with Victor's arrogance, now felt heavy with the silence of a funeral. Victor stood frozen, his eyes darting from the legal documents to the stone-faced investors who had, only moments ago, been his peers. The realization was a physical blow, more violent than any words. Every luxury he had flaunted, the tailored suits, the Italian shoes, the platinum watch, wasn't a trophy of his talent. It was a loan from the woman he had just tried to destroy. "Vera, please," he stammered, his voice losing its corporate baritone and thinning into a desperate whine. "We can talk about this. I was stressed. The pressure of the merger. I didn't mean those things." He took a step toward her, his hands reaching out, but Marcus Thorne stepped into his path like an immovable wall of granite. Vera didn't look up from the tablet Marcus had placed before her. She was already digitally signing the orders that would freeze every corporate account tied to Victor's name. "Stress doesn't create cruelty, Victor. It reveals it," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth he had spent 2 years taking for granted. "You told the board that you wanted to remove a liability. I'm simply honoring your request. You are the liability, and your termination is effective immediately." Chloe, seeing the ship sinking in real time, tried to slip toward the door, her face a mask of panic. "I had nothing to do with this," she hissed, but 2 security guards blocked her path. Vera finally looked up, her gaze landing on the mistress with a chilling neutrality. "Chloe, you'll find your own termination papers and a summons for a forensic audit of your department waiting at your desk. Don't bother taking the laptop. It's Langford property." Victor's knees seemed to buckle as the security team moved in. They didn't treat him like a CEO, they treated him like a trespasser. As they gripped his arms to lead him out, he looked back at Vera, his face contorted in a mix of horror and sudden agonizing clarity. He remembered the angel investors that saved him, the lucky breaks, and the rent-controlled apartment he thought was a sign of Vera's failure. It had all been her. Every cent in his pocket, every floor of this building, and every hope for his future had been held in the palms of the woman he had just publicly discarded. "You're nothing without me," he screamed, a last pathetic flare of ego as they dragged him toward the elevator. Vera watched the doors slide shut on his shouting face. She felt a flicker of the old Vera, the one who had hoped he would pass the test, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold reality of his betrayal. She looked down at the mahogany table, then at the investors who were now waiting for her command. The husband was gone. The downfall was complete. Now only the queen remained. 6 weeks had passed before Vera saw Victor again, and the man standing in the doorway of her private study was a ghost of the titan she had built. The tailored suits had been replaced by a frayed jacket, and the arrogance that once fueled every one of his steps had evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out frame. He didn't come with lawyers or threats this time. He came with a worn, leather-bound journal that Vera recognized instantly. It was her father's. "I didn't just meet you by chance, Vera," Victor said, his voice a jagged whisper that barely carried across the room. He didn't sit down. He stood in the shadows, looking at the floor as if the Langford crest on the rug was burning his feet. 10 years ago, when I was nothing but a hungry intern with no pedigree, Robert Langford pulled me aside. He saw something in me, a drive he said reminded him of his younger self. He mentored me in secret for years, paying my tuition, teaching me how to read a room, how to crush a competitor. Vera felt a cold shiver trace her spine. She had always wondered how Victor possessed such an instinctive grasp of her father's specific, ruthless business philosophies. "He gave me everything," Victor continued, finally looking up, his eyes rimmed with red. "But he gave it to me on one condition. He told me that one day I would meet a woman who would seem like she had nothing, but who carried his entire heart. He made me swear on my life that if I ever found her, I would protect her. He told me that if I could love the woman without the wealth, I would be the most powerful man on earth." He slumped against the doorframe, a broken sob catching in his throat. "I knew who you were the moment I saw you at that coffee shop 2 years ago, Vera. I knew you were the test. For the first year, I meant every word I said. I loved you because you were the key to the kingdom he promised me. But then he trailed off, his face twisting in shame. The power he taught me to crave became more important than the woman he told me to protect. I started to believe my own lie. I started to think I had outgrown the mentor, and in doing so, I outgrew the man I was supposed to be for you. Vera sat motionless, her hand resting on her stomach where her daughter kicked, a rhythmic reminder of the future. She realized now that her father's test hadn't just been for her, it had been a trap for Victor, a final lesson from the grave. Robert Langford had given Victor the tools to build an empire, but he had also given him the one thing that would destroy him if he lacked the character to hold it. Victor hadn't just betrayed a wife, he had betrayed the man who had authored his entire existence. He didn't just promise you a kingdom, Victor, Vera said quietly, the weight of the revelation settling over her. He promised you a soul, and you traded it for a title that I took back in 10 minutes. The silence in the study was heavy with the weight of a legacy that had finally reached its end. Vera looked at Victor, seeing not the titan he had pretended to be, nor the husband she had once adored, but a man who was utterly, fundamentally bankrupt of spirit. He stood trembling, waiting for the final blow, his fate resting in the hands of the woman he had deemed a distraction. Vera looked down at the ultrasound photo sitting on her desk, the grainy black and white image of a life that hadn't yet been touched by the Langford cynicism or the Ashford greed. She traced the outline of the tiny life on the paper. This was Grace. Her daughter wouldn't just inherit a $1 trillion empire, she would inherit the story of this moment. If Vera chose total destruction, if she used her lawyers to bury Victor and the criminal charges of corporate fraud and embezzlement that were currently sitting in a folder on her desk, she would be choosing her father's path. She would be the cold, vengeful queen who ruled through fear. But if she showed mercy to a man who had shown her none, was she being weak, or was she being the mother Grace deserved? You failed the test, Victor, Vera said, her voice quiet but carrying the absolute authority of the 72nd floor. But I won't fail my daughter by teaching her that the only response to betrayal is to become a monster. You won't go to prison, but you will disappear. I've had the lawyers draw up a settlement. You will sign over every remaining asset, every claim to the Langford name, and you will leave this city tonight. You will have enough to live a quiet, humble life, the kind of life you once claimed was enough for us. Victor looked up, a glimmer of pathetic hope reaching his eyes, but Vera held up a hand. Don't mistake this for forgiveness. It's an eviction. You are evicted from my life, from this company, and from Grace's future. You will never see her. You will never tell her your side of this story. You will be the man who was given the world and threw it away for a mistress and a title. She stood up, her hand resting firmly on her belly as she felt a sharp, rhythmic kick, a reminder of the strength she was building for two. Victor signed the papers with a shaking hand, his signature a jagged ruin of his former pride. As he slunk out of the room for the final time, Vera didn't feel the hollowness she had expected. She looked out the window at the city skyline, the lights of Langford Industries glowing like a constellation she finally knew how to navigate. Her father had taught her how to test the world, but Grace had taught her how to lead it. The test was over, the masks were gone, and for the first time in her life, Vera Langford wasn't just a trillionaire, she was free.